slides very quickly so that I can give enough time for question and answer. I think that's probably the more interesting part. So as Jeff said, I was an alumnus of this school, graduated about 15 years ago. And for the last 5 years, I've been working with this particular company, Biotronik, but I've been in the field of cardiac rhythm management for the last 14 years. So a little bit about Biotronik. It is the second oldest pacemaker and defibrillator company. Only Medtronic is older. So it was founded over 50 years ago in Germany, in West Germany, right when the wall went up. It was founded by a professor at the Technical University of Berlin, and he had one lab. He had a few of his colleagues, just like here how you guys have your different labs and your groups. And the sales in the first year were $1,000. Today the company is still privately held. It's run by the original founder's son. Worldwide headquarters in Berlin, but U.S. headquarters are in Portland, Oregon. We've grown to over 6,000 employees. We've got a full line of cardiovascular products. We focused primarily in cardiovascular. And last year we did about $1.5 billion in sales. So we have a very strong presence outside the U.S. With about 22% worldwide market share. In the U.S. we're almost at 10%. So we've grown tremendously. We're a very global company. We've got offices in Singapore, Brazil, Switzerland, Germany, and then the U.S. headquarters in Portland. It's a very traditionally conservative German principal company, so all the design is along the German idea where they don't want to necessarily sometimes be first to market with something, but they want to iterate and prove a concept and make sure that it's incredibly reliable after multiple generations. And unlike many other companies, all the components and the pieces that go into Biotronik devices, those components are manufactured by Biotronik itself. So it's complete control, vertically integrated organization where there's full quality control, cost control, and literally when you start doing your design, it's really designed for manufacturability because you've got the same team of people that are building these components. And the manufacturing is not done in China, it is done in a very handful of countries, US, Germany, and Switzerland. So very, very strict controls, and I think my next slide will kind of explain. In our industry, we've had numerous product recalls. Biotronik is the only company in this entire space that has not had a recall. And that, I think that speaks volume, because I'm sure we all know the statistics, and with Six Sigma and just the tight numbers that we're dealing with and the tolerances, it's quite a feat to have never a recall and never any product issues. So that's kind of been the approach, and it's helped because being a private company, if there were to be a recall, and you'd have like a class action lawsuit and multi-million-dollar settlement, we can't just like issue more shares of stock and pay the government or pay the regulators like some of the other companies have had. So that's why the owner has taken a very conservative approach that he'd rather take a little bit longer to release a product. He'd rather spend more on testing and do 100% online inspection just to make sure that what's going out through the door really is very, very reliable, because we don't want to take the chances. And some of the algorithms and features that Biotronik has put in their devices, like this one in the top left, closed loop stimulation, this was an algorithm that took over a decade to develop. And the idea of this is it's to mimic the sinus notes of the heart's own internal pacemaker and really create the most physiologic rate response. And it looks at the autonomic nervous system, measuring the transthoracic impedance and calculating inotropy or contractility. So it's one of the most reliable sensors in the market, and not only reliable, it's the most accurate in terms of mimicking the human sinus note. We were also the first company that had wireless home monitoring, so our patients can be traveling anywhere in the world where there's a GSM signal, and what looks like an overgrown cell phone, they would have that communicator, and it would basically do a routine every 24-hour checkup of the device and transmit that information to a secure website that clinicians and physicians all over the world would be able to get information about their own patients. We are also the first company outside the US that had full MRI compatibility without an exclusion zone for our pacemakers and defibrillators. And we'll be launching those products in the US pretty soon. And as the industry has changed so much towards simplicity and efficacy, gone are the days where doctors can just implant devices just because it's nice to have. Whatever people are putting in these days, there's so much of a cost component, there's so much of, is this efficacious, and does it really make sense for the patient? So most patients that get a defibrillator don't really need the atrial pacing capabilities. But what they do need is the diagnostics to distinguish between atrial fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia, or even exercise, sinus tachycardia. So Biotronik developed a device where you have basically on one lead where you've got your shocking coil that's in the right ventricle for the defibrillation. We also have a floating bipolar dipole in the atrium, in the atrial chamber, which is able to get signals, and it's very, very accurate. In this way, the device is able to use the same algorithms in the dual chamber device, but without having that additional lead that's more complications as well as cost for the patient in the hospital. So you've got the benefits of atrial sensing, but you don't have that additional lead. And that's done extremely well. Actually, right here at Johns Hopkins Med School, we're doing a clinical study with the med school. Over the years, the company's developed all these different types of innovations. I talked a little bit about home monitoring, a little bit about MRI. We also have the longest lasting batteries in the industry. In fact, we sell our batteries OEM to our competitors for them to put in their pacemakers. So our pacemakers can last over 10 years. And we're working on very interesting technologies outside the US, which should be coming in the next few years. We have stents, which are completely bioabsorbable. So after a few years, there's no metal, there's nothing left behind in the patient's vasculature. And the results so far are very promising. In terms of the market strategy and the business, what the company's done. So when I joined back in 2009, we were at about 450 or 500 sales reps in the United States. Today we're over 700. We're going to be opening up a business headquarters in Manhattan, close to a lot of the academic centers in the East Coast. And we're basically creating a complete, like a telepresence, so our customers who come to the New York office can basically look inside our factories in Berlin and meet with the founders and the executive team over there. We're doing a lot of programs for our cardiovascular fellows and doing a lot of medical education. And we're investing in new things like this MRI compatibility, which is a big deal because many patients, especially as the baby boomers are aging, as people are getting devices at younger ages and are going to be living a lot longer, you need to have a device that's not going to prevent them from requiring MRIs later on. And also we'll be introducing our full line of stents, drug-eluting stents, as well as bioabsorbable stents in the US in the next few years. So Jeff alluded a little bit about my background. So I finished up at Hopkins 15 years ago. Back then we still had concentrations, so I did a BME and E concentration and a business minor. Along the way, I also completed my MBA that I finished a couple of years ago. While I was at Hopkins, I had the chance to work with Professor Takor in the instrumentation lab. And every summer, so I grew up in Silicon Valley and came out to Hopkins for my undergrad, but I wanted to come back home every summer to get my internship. So my freshman year, I worked at a startup that was acquired by Edwards Life Sciences. My sophomore year, I worked for another startup that was acquired by St. Jude. And back then, Hopkins had a nice exchange program with universities in Austria. So I had an opportunity to work overseas in Austria for one summer my junior year. When I graduated in '99, the economy was good, just like it is now. I was able to get a job with a catheter company out in Silicon Valley, and I started doing all their animal studies, and I was able to, being a small company, within 2 months of being there, I was able to come back to Maryland and present our data to the FDA in Rockville. A couple months after that, we were able to present our data at conferences in France. And then about a year into the job, I got to work with one of the world's well-known EPs in Brazil and use my prototypes for patients that had Chagas disease. But being a startup company and a small company, I felt at that stage in my career, I wanted the opportunity to really learn from mentors and be a part of a team. So I went to a large company, Guidant, which is now Boston Scientific, and I did R&D and project management with them for about 2.5 years. Part of being a project manager as an engineer, you get the chance to actually see your project go from design to actually utilization in human beings. So I had the chance to spend a week with a surgeon in San Francisco and see how our products that I've been working on for the last 8-9 months and how it was performing in humans in cardiac surgery. That experience with the surgeon really piqued my interest, and I thought, I would like to be a sales rep in the medical industry where I get to work with patients, I get to work with doctors, and I'm actually firsthand seeing our technology that's being developed and the difference that it's making in people's lives. So Guidant was a very progressive company and gave me the opportunity to switch into sales. So I was with them for about 6 years as a sales representative in the pacemaker line of work. Along the way, my previous company wanted me to come back to them as head of worldwide sales. So I sort of worked 2 jobs in the year of 2008. I was a consultant still with Boston Scientific with pacemakers, but I was traveling around the world bringing on distributors in countries like Russia and China, Poland, South America, and trying to get the catheters for Cardiva to a worldwide presence. Unfortunately, the company ran out of funding and the doors were going to be closed, so I was able to take my old job back, come back into pacemakers, and I switched over along with my manager to the German company Biotronik 5 years ago, and I've been there ever since. So I'd love to open it up to questions and see if I can answer anything possible. Yes?
So you talked about how your company is private. What are some the advantages of working for a private company? You talked about how you got a recall that would be kind of really difficult in a private setting. What are some of the advantages you have?
The advantages are the owner does not care about answering to Wall Street and showing quarter-to-quarter growth or good margins. So if he wants, he can spend $20 million on a fully automated testing equipment that will pretty much test 100% of the products that we package and ship. None of our competitors would spend that kind of money for testing equipment. So being a private company, at the end of the day, the family, they're already billionaires. So if they're able to bring enough profit take home to their family at the end of the year that covers their lifestyle, they're pretty frugal. They're very keen on reinvesting as much of the company's profits back out into R&D, clinical programs, medical education, paying sales reps a better commission than anybody else. So you're able to do things a little bit differently. You're not. You can focus on quality and developing relationships and building customers.
So you said sales reps, you were talking about commissions. Could you explain about that a bit more?
So, with most sales jobs, you have, you're paid based on what you're selling. So in our line of business, when a patient gets a pacemaker, the rep has to be there. So we are technically assisting the doctor. We bring all the equipment, we're controlling the patient's heart, we're measuring amplitudes and capture thresholds and impedances, and we're customizing and programming that device for that particular patient. Then the next morning when they're to be discharged from the hospital, the reps have to come back in, do a full interrogation on our computer, make sure everything's working fine, because sometimes, over the course of the night, if the patient lifts their arms and move it around, they can actually dislodge that lead. It takes about a month for that lead to, embed into the cardiac tissue. So the doctor really wants us to go back the next day, check it out, and let them know if everything's okay to send the patient home. Then the patient comes back in the physician's office a week later, where they do a wound check the dressing, make sure there's no infection. We're brought in then, again, to interrogate the device, make sure everything's working fine. Then after that, for the course of the life of that battery, we're in the doctor's office every 3 to 6 months, interrogating the device, looking for any episodes, any arrhythmias, because so much of what a cardiologist does for treating these patients, it's adjusting their medication based on their disease state. Well, the devices store so much data, almost like beat to beat if there are any irregular episodes, that the device goes hand in hand with pharmacology. So at that point, we really become a trusted advisor to the clinician. But we don't get paid for any of that. So the only time we get paid is at the time of implant, where we bill the hospital for the device, and we get a commission on that. But then for the rest of the time that the patient has that device, whether their defibrillator goes off in the middle of the night, we have to go and check the device. And all that is free. It's a service that comes with it. So it's a very hands-on, technically oriented sale, different from You know, when people think of sales, I think of pharmaceutical sales reps that just go in and bring lunch and give samples to their staff.
So then you have like a base of patients that you see for.
Yeah. And then when their battery needs to be changed, which back in the day was only about 3 to 5 years, you'd have to put in a whole new device. The same leads that were implanted 5 years ago, those are part of the patient's heart, and those would remain. But the battery is hermetically sealed in the device. So then we'd have to actually put in a new device, and we would bill for another one at that time. Now batteries have gotten much better, so we don't just do that for about 10 years. So then we would, you know, charge again and get the commission again at that time.
So it's only commission, or is there also a separate salary?
So with Biotronik, you have an option to go either way. You can either take a small, very small base salary, which would be like $3,000 a month, not barely enough to cover living expenses, and then you get a commission on top of that. And then the company would pay your car allowance, your cell phone, an expense account where you can be able to take out customers. And that's one option. That's if you're taking on as like a direct representative. Then they also allow, which is what a lot of the other European companies do, where you are like a distributor for them, where you're an independent sales agent. And in that case, you have no salary, you have no expenses, nothing is covered by them, but you get a much higher commission. So when I first came on with Biotronik for 2 years, I was a little bit cautious. I took the approach where I had a little bit of a salary and a commission. But then for the last 3 years, I've just been pure commission. And it's been fun. I mean, if you have the relationships with the physicians, and if you're able to manage the expenses of the business, it can be quite lucrative.
How did you go about making all these contacts?
Well, I've been in the same geography for 7 years. So I was calling on those same customers even when I was at the other company. So it's time. I mean, a lot of my customers initially, they didn't even open the door to me when I switched over to Biotronik because they had never used the company before. It was an unknown entity to them. Even though the company had been around in Europe for many years, it really took a push into the US market 5 years ago. So because I have a relationship with the doctors, I was able to say, look, give me a chance. I'm not asking for your business today or tomorrow, but allow me to show you the due diligence that I did, and let me have an opportunity to share that information with you, and then you can make an informed decision for yourself. So I brought in the president of Biotronik US to my area. We did a technical overnight, we did a tech night presentation where the physicians could work with the computer, the nurses could come in, they could ask lots of questions. They were very impressed with the reliability and track record because they had dealt with so many of the product recall issues of the other companies that they were impressed that here was a company that they wouldn't have to answer to their patients. Hey, sorry, there's a recall. Now you're going to have to come in every 3 months instead of every 6 months for closer scrutiny and follow-up. So they liked that. They appreciated the fact that it was a privately held company, and all the components were made by Biotronik. Nothing was outsourced and getting some OEM manufacturer from China or some other place where you may not have the same level of FDA and ISO standards. So all these different things, I worked hard for about 90 days for the first 3 months when I came on. And finally then, the same customers that I was working with before, they slowly started trickling in and adding me into their rotation. Because most of the doctors I work with, they want to use a little bit of all the companies. They don't want to put all their eggs in one basket. So they said, all right, we'll give you a chance and be a part of the rotation.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
You said you've been in the same area for 7 years.
Yeah.
What advice would you have for the students, PhD students, who don't have that, network that you have, and they want to go into the industry? What would be your advice to them to leave Hopkins as a PhD student and go into the industry?
Definitely, I'll be very happy to share that. So when I was in Hopkins, I started in fall of 1995. It was a very different school than it is today. I mean, every time I come back, every couple of years, I'm blown away with the opportunities and the investment that the school has made. So back then, our career center, we didn't even really have a full-fledged career center. And if we did, it was more like your traditional big companies like IBM and Johnson & Johnson that would come in and would interview Hopkins students. Well, there would be like 50, 60 students signing up for interviews for maybe like 2 or 3 spots. So I realized, all right, this approach is not going to work. I knew I wanted to work in Silicon Valley because that's where my parents were, and that was my base. So back then, of course, this was really early days. There was no Google even. but there was always a newspaper. So the newspaper, our local paper in San Francisco, would always track venture capital investments based on sector. So I remember having my dad save a couple of the issues that came out like right before spring break, my freshman year. And he had saved all those newspapers that were talking about which new startup companies were getting funding based on, biotech, devices, software, early stage internet. And pretty much I contacted during my first freshman year spring break, I contacted every one of the medical device companies. And about 7 out of those 15 called me back and said, sure, send us your resume and see what we can do. And 3 of them called me for an interview and 2 of them gave me an offer. 1 of them was unpaid, 1 of them was paid. And the one that I ended up taking, I was the 4th employee of that company that summer. And I literally helped them from like ordering furniture to even setting up bench test equipment stations. And by the end of the summer, we'd already produced like a small mini white paper that was gonna help the company get the next round of funding. So I would say you have to be creative. Start somewhere now it's so much easier with Google. It's so much easier with the deep alumni network that Hawkins has. I mean, you can talk to her, you can talk to Kathy, you can talk to any of the people and be like, I am interested in this geography. I am interested in this sector, or this area within biotech and med devices. Do we have alumni that are part of that? And you can start from there. I mean, I'm helping right now one of your colleagues and trying to see if we can get him a job at Biotronik in Oregon. And the other thing I would say is, this is the stage in your life, not married, don't have kids, don't have mortgage. Be as flexible as possible. Go anywhere, not in the country, go anywhere in the world. Places like Singapore, their government has set up a sovereign fund just to invest in biotechnology. I mean, it's staggering. My brother-in-law, he has his own company, and he told me he came back from Singapore last week. They're willing to write a blank check for $5 million to get his next round of milestones. So there are a lot of interesting opportunities, both in the US, but even outside the US. So experience is experience. And then this, as you saw with Biotronik, it's a global company, and more companies are trying to diversify and globalize. That's where a lot of opportunities are.
So you've worked for both startups and for Boston Scientific, the really big name companies. So can you provide a little insight on the differences in how you liked working at a startup versus a big company, the pros and cons?
Sure, definitely. So the first startup that I worked for my freshman year, I had the opportunity to meet one of the board of directors, who is a very well-known venture capitalist. I've kept in touch with him ever since then. He's kind of been my mentor. The advice that he actually gave me was, when you're coming out of college, the first job, try to get it at a big, good, well-established blue chip company. Because you will learn the right methodologies, the right discipline, and the right approach of doing things. So at that time, Guidance or Boston Scientific wasn't recruiting at Hawkins, but that was my first choice. I wanted to work for them, but I couldn't get that job. So I took the startup, and I used it as instead of doing a master's, that year and a half of the startup was like my real world practical master's. So I had that experience under my belt, then it made it a lot more attractive to the big company to hire me. And the benefit of being at that big company initially, I didn't have the kind of global exposure and visibility that I did at the startup, but I was able to learn from a lot of different people who had years and years of experience. I was sitting in on meetings that were cross-functional meetings with marketing, regulatory, manufacturing, clinical, sales, and me as the R&D representative. So getting to see that whole process of product development and introduction in the medical device industry, that was extremely helpful. And the benefit, again, of being in a big company, they allowed me to make that transfer from engineering to sales, which a startup can't take. They can't afford that risk of somebody having that learning curve who's never done a job before, now throwing them into a role like that. Yes, you do wear multiple hats in a startup, but they like to hire people that have years of experience, because time is money. They want to get their next round of funding. They need people that know what they're doing and can get them to the next level. So I'd say it's great to start off career if you can in a big company, but then move into that entrepreneurial smaller company where you can really make a difference and you can climb the lot faster.
What made you want to go back to do your MBA?
I had always wanted to do my MBA even while I was at Hawkins. After my freshman year, when I knew I wasn't pre-med, I knew I was going to go into industry. So that's why I chose to do, they just started the business minor at that time. So all my electives, my non-science courses at BME, I chose business courses, so it was very easy to do the business minor. And at that time, I knew that, to get into the good traditional business schools, you want, between 3 and 5 years of work experience, take the GMATs, and then apply to business school. So right around the time when I was the 5-year mark out of being at Hopkins, I had taken the GMAT, and I was starting to apply to business school. But I had the chance to switch from R&D into sales. And that's when my mentor and some of my other family members who were executives, they said, you can always do your MBA later, but if you want to be a CEO someday, you got to have sales experience. You got to understand the customer, you have to understand your markets. So if you are getting the chance without having to get an additional degree and make the switch from engineering to sales, take that and seize the opportunity to get that experience. You can always do the MBA later. And I did it 5 years later, but I did it part-time so that I could still keep my job, keep my territory, not take out student loans, and then go do the MBA on the weekends and then finish my degree.
So I have one question. What advice would you give to PhD students applying to these positions that we won't have the experience that some other candidates would, so how can we make our application stronger or leverage our PhD versus actual experience?
I think you can, in this environment where, especially some of the smaller companies or bigger companies, they need people that know what they're doing. They want people that are very detail-oriented, very diligent, very methodical. I think you can kind of make the case that being a PhD student from a world-class institution, you may not have a lot of industry experience, but what you've done through all your projects, and try to, I would say, highlight as much of the collaborative and teamwork that you've had through the course of your graduate work. Highlight that in those experiences, because when people talk, we want industry experience, we want industry experience, what they're really highlighting, in my opinion, is that they want to see that can this person get along with others? Can they actually get the job done? And so much of what we do in life is not just relying only on our own efforts, but how we can leverage our strengths and others' strengths and collectively put something good. And I see, Hopkins is doing a great job with that, even at the undergraduate level now with the design team. And I'm sure in the graduate programs, you guys are having a chance to do things like that. So I'll highlight and stress that, and hopefully that can, you convince some people that it's sort of a substitute or alternative for industry experience. And the other thing I would stress is flexibility. Being willing to work anywhere, do anything, and just get that experience. So once you have your foot in the door, they'll see what a good person you are, and then the promotions and lateral moves will start coming.
So, Joey made it, so thank you.
Thank you very much. If you have any questions later on, and any my email, I know I put it up there, but feel free to email me and I'll be glad to help.